As I said last week in class, you guys are free to work on groups in regards to the study guide. So if you want to contact a couple people from the Monday class, or you got friends in this class, whatever you guys want to do, again, it's going to be the exact same quiz, exact same final. So it's the same questions on both, which um, again may just be easier to work in groups if again, you know, some people from the Monday class. So. Um, no reason not to. I always encourage group work and everybody participating and working together, not just pinning it on one person to get it all done. And so let me go ahead and share this with you guys so we see what we're looking at here. So again, so for this week, here's your Deuteronomy survey due on Thursday. We're already almost at the end of April. Breathing on May. Breathing on May. So out come the Justin Timberlake memes saying it's going to be May. Happens every year, so it's about the seasonal tradition for those to come out. Um, and so that being said, again, we're getting close to the final. We'll go over it next week. Here's your study guide here that you'll find. Um, week 15. We'll go through a couple things next week. But if you have any questions as you're working on the study guide, I would encourage you to work on it even a little bit earlier. This worksheet number 14 isn't due next week. It's due the last day of of finals week, which I believe is like May 9th or something like that, or no, 13th. Um, 13th. So you have literally a whole week and a half to get, like almost 2 weeks to get it done. So if you're needing some extra credit, you'll have it with that worksheet. And on Thursday, we'll be working on an in class assignment or project that you'll get one you'll get time to do, and it's not overly difficult, and you'll get extra credit for that as well. So you that's not just a reason to be here for Thursday, but if you're feeling a little stressed because you know you have assignments you need to turn in, do know that you have some extra credit coming your way, extra credit opportunities. So along with the ones that have already been I haven't applied them yet, but they will be applied here in a couple weeks. So I'm working through. I'm up to about week 8. I know there's a couple emails that have come in asking me when I'm going to get to grading these, but weeks 9 through 13. But I'll be getting to them today, tomorrow, and then Thursday. So I should be all caught up with late work. And this is just as a general of announcement that if you do have late work, just turn it in and then let me know. You don't need to ask for permission. You don't need to smother me with praises about how glorious my hair is or how whatever my generous and kind and compassionate professor. No, just hey, professor, have some late work I just turned in. Let me know which week it's for. That way I know where to look and be able to get your grade updated as quickly as possible. Um, so again, just pay attention to those things. Again, you don't need to ask for permission to turn in late work. You've got the permission granted. So there you go. And just send me an email, let me know what you had turned in. Really more than anything, so that way you're not waiting another 3-4 weeks before I finally kind of come back, especially if it's at the start of the semester. So, are there any questions, comments, concerns about any of those? And again, next week we'll work through some of the things in the study guide. But if you are stumped with something as you're taking a look at it, as you're working through it, feel free to send me an email. A lot of the answers, if not all the answers, you'll find from past lectures. You'll find them in the PowerPoints, and you'll find them in and through your assignments as well. Um, and so again, if you're stumped in a certain part, please feel free to reach out and let me know, so we can start piecing these things together and you be able to get the best grade possible for your final. So, are there any questions, comments? Questions? Still working on if it's going to be a whole day thing or if it's going to have to be a 3 hour quiz. So, and I know some of you are going to need some accommodations, which we'll talk through next week once I have a finalized answer. But it is at least going to be those questions specifically. All right. Are there any, no, if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and jump into lecture for today. Um, yeah, there's no questions. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump into it for today. Let me share this with you all. We're closing on the end here. We talked rounded out last week, talking about Deuteronomy, and in talking about Deuteronomy specifically focused on love, and what love looks like in regards to covenantal relationship. And again, what love looks like in Deuteronomy looks a lot like obedience, the actions that flow from love or the feeling of love. And so, as we talked through the day, I'm gonna review a couple things that I had mentioned last week, but especially pertinent for your final to know that'll be coming up here. And so I just wanted to be able to recover that. But again, as we continue through Deuteronomy, the big thing that I want for us to know and to have embedded within our minds is the reality that for Israel, what their ethics, their daily life looks like is guided and motivated by this heartfelt obedience towards living out this Torah that has been given to them that governs the whole of their lives. And so we're going to take a look today. Um, One, we're going to review a tiny bit, not a ton. We're going to view a tiny bit in looking at um, some of the layout for Deuteronomy that I had mentioned last week, but didn't necessarily elaborate, and I said I would. And then looking at the 10 words or 10 commandments as expressed both in Exodus and then Deuteronomy. And so I'd mentioned last week those three sermons or speeches, and this is how it's broken down. I didn't necessarily give exact like parsings of where they're at, but this is kind of how it's laid out. You have one to chapter 4, and you'll notice that they're kind of introductory phrases. These are the words that Moses spoke to Israel beyond the Jordan. This is the law that Moses set before the Israelites. These are the words of the covenant the Lord commanded Moses to make with the Israelites. And so again, you have this repetitive pattern. If it's kind of like if you were to write a letter and you started out, "Dear Bobby," and you wrote for 16 pages, and then you write again, "Dear Bobby." So again, you have this you see these kinds of introductions that cue us in on there's a new section coming up, and that's what Deuteronomy is cueing us into. But I had also had said that Deuteronomy does lay out like a suzerain vassal treaty. Does anybody remember what was I want to say the definition of a suzerain vassal? What how did well, I guess we'll focus somewhere else, but with suzerain vassal treaties, the way that they function is that you'd have the suzerain, oftentimes a person who was in power, a king, a lord, that would often be approached by a vassal or make a deal with a vassal, and then they would come up with a covenant together that the suzerain would be obligated to keep certain components of the covenant, and the vassal would be obligated to keep their side of the covenant as well. And so, what we find in Deuteronomy, and this is by M. Klein in the 1960s, had seen Deuteronomy as a whole as an extended suzerain vassal treaty. An extended suzerain vassal treaty. And the reason why this is really important is because it helps to frame our interpretation in the way we understand Deuteronomy as a covenantal partnership between two parties. A covenantal partnership between two parties. And so when we see things in Deuteronomy, and I'll go over this more next week when we talk about curses and blessings as we round out Deuteronomy, um, that some components of that are taken almost more like superstition, where you did something bad when you were a kid and now your car breaks down. Well, that's that curse. Um, that you did something last week, and so it's almost kind of turns into almost like karma, because of the ways in which certain parts of portions like Deuteronomy are being read. And so, again, to help us rightly understand Deuteronomy as this covenant treaty between two agreeing parties and how they function within its context, then we end up doing some really we can end up doing some really weird stuff with it that wasn't the intention of the original authors, and just is not helpful for life of faith. Um, and so, some of the things that we'll see outlined here are preamble, again, the introduction of the two parties. And we'll see this when we talk about Exodus and Deuteronomy, the way the introductory formula of how Yahweh introduces himself and then how Israel is described. You have that historical prologue describing Yahweh's journey in the wilderness with the people and how he's brought them to this land and how he's spoken with their ancestors. You have those stipulations, which form a huge chunk of Deuteronomy. You have those basic stipulations and then the detailed. We'll go over more detailed stipulations. We'll go over part of it today, but we'll go over more extensively some of the regulations, especially with Israel's civic life, their community life on Thursday. You have those curses and blessings, which again is part of the ratification. And then you have succession agreement arrangements between the invocation of witnesses and the provision of public reading. So yeah, these are components that you will want to know for your test. Have them written down, screenshot it, download the PowerPoint, whatever you need to do to have this written down, because it will show up again on your final to recognize what are the certain components of within Deuteronomy that marks it as a kind of suzerain vassal treaty. And so the 10 words. So we're going to do, we're going to break into groups, and then we're going to read through Deuteronomy 20 and then Deuteronomy 5. It looks like a lot of verses, but they read really quick. Literally, you shall not steal is one verse. You shall not kill is one verse. And so it goes through very quickly. So what you're going to want to do is note the similarities and differences, and what are the differences? And then think through, why are those differences significant? What changes about the law? And then what might this say about the nature of God's relationship with his people? And so I'll post this in the little message board that sends you, not the message board, the chat that sends out the messaging to you guys. So I'm gonna go ahead and break you guys into groups so you guys can read through this, and then we'll get back together in 10 minutes. Let me. All right, and so for those of you, again, as always, for those of you that have your cameras turned off, don't be creepy. Either turn it on or just let your group know that you're there, and then we'll get back together and talk about it, be about it. What else? Any specifics?
Not only do they have like the same like commands, like you shall do this or you shall not do this, but they also have like the same, I guess, like commentary on them. You know, like where it says, um, uh, like where it says, wait, sorry, hold on, I have to pull it back up.
Yeah, you can.
Like where it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and then it says, like, for the Lord will not leave unpunished the one who takes his name in vain.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Good. So a lot of the rationale of the reasons for why keeping a certain commandment is similar. Good. What's the difference? What are some of the differences? There's one kind of glaring one.
You asked about the differences?
Yeah.
The main one that I saw was when he was talking, or both of the passages were talking about the Sabbath. The one in Deuteronomy brings up slavery, while the Exodus one doesn't.
Exactly. Exactly. What seems to be the kind of controlling narrative or the reason why they ought to observe Sabbath in Exodus? What's the narrative there?
That one talks about creation.
Good. And I'll go ahead and help you guys out with this specific question. Good. Exodus is much more concerned about keeping Sabbath because of the creation narrative. And in Deuteronomy, what's the kind of controlling narrative there, or the rationale there for Sabbath?
That they were under control by the like by Pharaoh, and God released them, I guess.
Oh, what was that? Sorry, that cut out.
Oh, I said just that. Damn, I kind of forgot. I'm not gonna lie.
Oh, you're good. But what story is Deuteronomy pulling from? If I can say it that way. Exodus is pulling from the creation story, but Deuteronomy is pulling from somewhere else. What was that?
It's pulling from Exodus.
There you go. Pulling from the Exodus event. It's drawing its rationale, its basis from this story that Israel had experienced and being delivered, we might say saved from the hand of Pharaoh. You remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Lord your God brought you out from there from a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And so good. Thank you for that, Nicole. That the biggest difference between the two are regulations regarding the Sabbath. Exodus draws on this creation narrative, but Deuteronomy draws on this Exodus event. And the reason why I bring these things up is that does the demand or does the obligation to keep Sabbath change? All right, Elijah, I see your head shaking. No, good. It doesn't change, but what changes?
The rationale.
There you go. The rationale for changes, or again, the basis for why the teaching or the word or the commandment, however you want to phrase it, it ought to be kept. And so again, the reason why I bring this up is because of the fact that it's important for us to recognize some of the differences of what appears to be what you might run into in some places where there's contradictions in the Bible. There might be places of complication, but this isn't one of them. And what appears to be a contradiction is more a development in Israel's not only understanding, but then also experience with Yahweh as his relational deliverer. And the reason why I bring that up is because it introduces for us so much of the way Israel's worship and their ethics are intertwined together. What they do, what we might call what they do in church and what they do on their Monday through Saturday, it's all blended together. And we're going to tease out some of these implications here. But why some of these differences is that Deuteronomy has a concern for an ethic based on the Exodus event. And note that the Exodus event in the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew imagination is the event of the revealing of God, the nature of God's character, of who God is as relational deliverer, as the Holy One of Israel, as this God who's completely different than all the other gods, whose character runs counter to Pharaoh, that Pharaoh who oppresses, Yahweh liberates. Pharaoh who uses bodies and pushes them to just produce, Yahweh gives them rest and even commands them to take one day off a week from their work. And so again, and I'll elaborate more on Sabbath here in a minute. And to be reminded that Israel has been chosen from among the nations as a sign of God's faithfulness to humanity. That the rehearsing of this narrative for all people, and that's why the inclusion, as has been brought up, the inclusion of slaves, male and female slaves, male and female servants, even animals in the land get to take a break. That again, this covenant faithfulness and living it out gives way towards a kind of justice in the earth, or of an enactment of what we see in that original vision over in Genesis 1 and 2 of God being present with the people. And then Deuteronomy will redefine much of what is the discussion around Israel's ethics and the religious life in terms of God's purposes for the world. That through Israel's obedience, that the purpose of reconciling all things back to God's self is achieved. It's not based on Israel's size or even their own righteousness, their right standing with God, but rather because of God's purposes for the world, that these things will come to pass. And so the Sabbath in Israel, why Sabbath? First, you saw why that change in Deuteronomy towards his inclusion towards Exodus, but why Sabbath? And the connection between Sabbath and Exodus again emphasizes this act of remembrance through embodied practices. The act of remembrance through embodied practices that Deuteronomy has and we'll talk about this next week. Deuteronomy has a strong emphasis on remember over and over again. Why? Because a certain kind of amnesia, a certain kind of forgetfulness, not only marks Israel's story later on, but will become the threat over and over again. Will be threatening Israel's not only allegiance to Yahweh, but then also their commitment to living as a just and generous community with one another. And so again, so what Sabbath does is reinforces that embodied practice of who the people are as Yahweh's covenant people, and remembering this Exodus event where God brought these people out to himself and marked them as a special people unto himself. And that this embodied practice, everyone gets the Sabbath, not just those who can economically afford to do so. That some of the parallels in other ancient Near Eastern cultures for people that were able to take a day off were often relegated towards those who were economically advantaged to be able to do so. But obviously for slaves who didn't own property and for servants who were serving their masters, they get no days off. And so again, the inclusion across the socioeconomic status, across genders, and again, the inclusion of animals in the land shows Yahweh's concern of seeing rest happen, this alternative community happen for all peoples, not just for those who are economically advantaged. And we'll talk about more on Thursday and elaborate some more on this, because it will go into more detail, specifically talking about widows, orphans, migrants, and the poor, and Yahweh's special concern for those who are economically disadvantaged, and what safeguard Yahweh builds into Israel's community life that becomes the means that God provides for his people. And so again, but Sabbath initially reinforces this commitment towards seeing, again, both worship and justice integrally linked together. And the intention for Sabbath to reinforce this distinctive memory of Israel having been preserved from the hand of Pharaoh through Yahweh's mighty act, outstretched arm, mighty hand, that forms, again, this public act of identity. That's not just me that was saved from Pharaoh, but us that were saved from Pharaoh. As they engage in this kind of act of resistance and being able to not only participate in rest, to be reminded of the kind of countercultural deity that Yahweh is. Whereas, again, that where Pharaoh oppresses and pushes people to primarily produce, and their value or their worth is based on production, Yahweh gives rest. Where Pharaoh is paranoid, desiring of power, to the point where Pharaoh kills all the newborn boys, what does Yahweh do? Yahweh gives life through giving rest. And that the first day begins with rest for us. Being Christians now, the first day being Sabbath. And so it's all through Israel's ethics and observations, both of their religious life and their civic life, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but that it forms this kind of alternative community where, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender, regardless of class, regardless of socioeconomic status, that you get to participate in this practice as a community that is meant for the welfare of everyone involved. And then this act of hope, of looking forward to the day when everyone gets to rest, when everyone is brought into this community of shalom, this community of peace. Again, gathered together with God in the land, a kind of recovery of Genesis 1 and 2. And so, again, what I'm wanting to emphasize at this specific juncture of looking at Sabbath and seeing some of the ethical concerns that are embedded within this kind of reconfiguration in Deuteronomy, of what we're trying to get at is the merging between Israel's religious life and what we might call their ethics or their politics. I'm going to go ahead and read this passage so we can kind of see. But one of the things I want to be able to highlight again is are the merging of these two things that in Deuteronomy 16 we see, observe the month of Aviv by keeping the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Aviv, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd at the place that the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. You shall appoint judges and officials throughout your tribes, in all your towns that the Lord your God has given you, and they shall render just decisions for the people. You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality. You must not accept bribes, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Justice, and only justice, you shall pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land the Lord your God has given you. You shall not plant any tree as a sacred pole beside the altar that you make for the Lord your God, nor shall you set up a stone pillar, things that the Lord your God hates. And so all within chapter 16, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but you see regulations for feasts, religious feasts, regulations for how one ought to operate in a legal capacity, not showing bribes or rendering just decisions. And then here, regulations against idolatry, all within the same chapter. All within the same chapter. That the Israelites were given a cultic system, what we might call a cultic system, this Mishkan, the tent of God's dwelling, so they can have a relationship with God. And again, this is what so much of what Leviticus is trying to get at, is the maintenance of the maintenance of relationship with Yahweh, given the effect and problem and issues pertaining to sin. That how does Israel continue in the relationship with God? Yahweh helps to appoint a sacrificial system and creates the means for the people to participate in the relationship with himself. So again, this cultic system of participating in feasts, of not engaging in idolatrous practices, of going to temple, of washing hands, of doing certain things that aren't the means of the relationship themselves, but rather are the things that help continue the relationship, if that makes sense. That the practices aren't the relationship themselves, but rather help to provide the means in order to engage in the relationship. So if there's, again, any sin that's in the way, then sacrificial system is not the end in and of itself, but rather sacrificial system exists as the kind of bridge, or to create, to fix the breach in the bridge, in order that brings together God and humanity. Then they're also given a civil system. The word mishpat meaning justice. Also a legal order so that they can relate well with one another. Again, that the demand for judges and those who are appointed as chiefs over legal issues are commanded to be able to carry out justice, not to take bribes, in order, again, for the people to be able to relate well to one another. But based on your reading of Deuteronomy thus far, is there a divide between the civil and the sacred? It's not a true question, I promise. Is there a divide between the civil and the sacred?
Can you repeat the question, please?
It's right here on the slide. Based on your reading of Deuteronomy so far, is there
Oh, my bad.
is there a division between the civil and the sacred, given what we had just read and what we just talked about with Sabbath? How the people worship and relate to God and how the people relate to one another.
It doesn't seem like there's much divide.
Good. No, there really isn't a divide at all between how an individual demonstrates their allegiance to Yahweh and operates in relationship with their neighbor. And in so much that there's no dichotomy between whether or not we ought to love God or ought to love their neighbor, but the demonstration of love for neighbor is demonstrated in their love for God, and their love for God is demonstrated in their love for neighbor. So it's kind of this reciprocating circle of endless and abounding love, if you want to think about it that way. But it's, again, the reason why I bring these two together is because of the thought that, one, that we shouldn't talk about politics in church, but that's biblically unfaithful to do. Second, the concern in Deuteronomy, in as much as it's concerned with the faithful allegiance of the people following their God in and through the wilderness in order to get to the promised land, is stymied. What gets in the way more often than anything else is injustice. Because, and I'll bring this up later, but I'll introduce it now and I'll say it 1,000 times. Injustice and idolatry are integrally linked. Wherever there's injustice, there's going to be idolatry. Wherever there's idolatry, there's going to be injustice. And that rings true in Israel's history, and it still rings true today. Why are women and children abducted and sold into sex trafficking? Because of greed, because of lust. Specific idolatries that lead towards inhumane and cruel actions by other human beings. Why are children forced to work in other parts of the world instead of going to school? Often because of violence, poverty, and greed. Again, specific kinds of idolatries that lead towards injustice in general. That's, again, specific to the Christian community for our sake, is that we have to be able to name the specific injustices and the idolatries which are often hidden behind those injustices, whether not for the sake of not for the sake of being a though it'll happen, not for the sake of being a kind of zealot revolutionary, but being able to speak truthfully about our allegiances and where they lie. And that in naming idolatries, and will happen to name injustices that flow from those idolatries. And I'll talk about this here. I believe I'll get to it the second half. I'll get to it on Thursday, because this issue comes up in Isaiah 5, where you have the rich that are adding more and more and more to their land, and the poor have nowhere to go. And so Isaiah, speaking as a representative of God, uses words like Sheol, the place of the dead, has opened its mouth for you, those of you that do not practice justice. And those who are taking a bribe will go down as Jerusalem's noble, which again is talking about this exile that's coming. And so there's a specific kind of attention that we want to pay to these kinds of things, especially as it affects communities of faith. And so again, the civil sacred divide, that how we relate to our neighbors and how we worship God, like they're integrally linked. And for us to think that there's no relationship between the songs that we sing and the activities and behaviors we perform from Monday through Saturday have no effect, no relationship, we're missing it. And so, so cooking must not have been considered work since they could still do that on the Sabbath. It just depends on part of Jewish tradition says that you will not cook, you're not going to light a fire, you're not going to kill an animal, um, and so that's why things had to be prepared a day in advance, so that they wouldn't do anything that resembled close to work. And so, part of that again has to do with the interpretation of what does it mean to work. And for some people love cooking. That is, cooking's not work at all. It's actually something fun that they get to do, and it's relaxing, it's enjoyable. Um, but again, it just depends on the interpretation of how, if we're thinking about it in an Old Testament context, cooking would be considered work. But again, those stipulations start getting loosened up a little bit post Jesus. Not so much that we're free from Sabbath, as much as we're free to keep Sabbath and to be able to see the heart of what God's intention is for all of creation, which is rest. And so, in the application of that, we need wisdom in order to make it happen. And so, I had mentioned earlier that we're going to talk about these three pilgrim festivals that are mentioned at the top of Deuteronomy 16. Real quick, before I jump into this, are there questions? I always do this. I always want to jump to the next thing. Are there any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Thoughts about my thoughts? Does you guys have to talk to me here. Does this start to hopefully somewhat start to make sense of the necessary kind of links between worship's kind of community life and their, I'll say, their spiritual life or their religious life? Yay, nay, no, maybe, kinda. Okay, we got a couple of head nods. So I'll take those head nods as definitive for everybody else's feelings. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I do want to emphasize that again in Deuteronomy, the concern is for when they get into the land, that their demonstration of loyalties are not just religious, but also social. The two are integrally linked together, which is why you'll have in certain places in the Gospels, why these Pharisees start freaking out when Jesus heals on the Sabbath. Why? Because he's working. When Jesus and his dudes, they're out there picking heads of grain, which is what the poor would have done. And why, again, the Pharisees accuse him of working. That these practices and habits of what Jesus does engages in this kind of unnecessary dichotomy that splits the vision of Yahweh's intentions of recovering wholeness, not just for the sake of humanity, but recovering wholeness for humanity, and then giving Israel this vision, these commandments, in order to see it happen collectively. That is, these aren't just a bunch of good ideas, but rather how Yahweh is working to help Israel be a light to the nations. Again, through the practices of loyalty, these demonstrations of loyalty, not just religious, but also social. Like, yeah, it's good to go to temple, but it's also good to take care of widows and orphans, migrants, and the poor. That these are all demonstrations of loyalty, covenant commitment. So, thoughts, concerns, comments? Is that helpful at all for reading this differently, these texts differently? Yeah. In what way is it helpful? Because again, my intention is that you guys don't just see this as kind of like cold legal stuff that is just for them and has very little implication for us. More specifically, how we see Jesus um, fulfill a lot of what this is saying and living out what this is saying. That's my intention. I don't know if that's being received or not, but again, that's the goal of why I elaborate on a lot of this. So, okay, we've got a few more minutes here. That with these three feasts, do you have specific times that are set up in Israel's calendar year or religious year that helps them to celebrate and recognize who they are as Yahweh's people? You have Passover, in Hebrew Pesach, would be the ingathering of barley, which there is a meal that is celebrated with Passover, where they do, among other things, eat bitter herbs and drink salt water in order to remember the bitterness of slavery and oppression um, that their ancestors had experienced. But this celebrates Yahweh's deliverance from Egypt, or rather remembers Yahweh's deliverance from Egypt. Celebrate sounds almost too positive. Then you have Pentecost, which is Shavuot, and that's really just a celebration of harvest. The wheat's out there. Let's go ahead and go get it. Then you have Tabernacles, Sukkoth, and this is what you would do is you gather in the fruit. Um, and you'll see these, especially these two. You obviously this one is a little more obvious in Acts 2, where on the day of Pentecost when a lot of people are gathered. But you'll see this described as Feast of Weeks, not Feast of Weeks. You'll see it as the Festival of Lights or Feast of Lights, Feast of Booths or Festival of Booths, or you'll see Feast of Tabernacles, and that's what it's referring to. Is that what they would do is that you would pitch tents in and around Jerusalem as a way to remember Israel's time of wandering in the wilderness. And still for certain observing Orthodox Jews, what they'll do is that they'll live in a tent for a week in the front yards usually, or backyards, usually as a way to remember this time of wandering in the wilderness. So they go outside their homes in order to remember this. And so again, these times, specific 3 times in Deuteronomy that are set aside in order to help the people to remember and to reenact these times of Yahweh's provision of Israel's the harvest, and then Israel's time of wandering, and then the deliverance from Egypt. But you'll notice that California and Israel, we share very similar weather patterns as a Mediterranean climate. And those of you that have been in Israel will know. You have kind of rainy winters, not so much anymore. They kind of come and go, but very dry summers, that's for sure. You have the spring transition of April through June kind of happening, and then you have that fall transition of mid-September through mid-November. And so again, you kind of have this cyclical pattern where the rains come, and then you have the kind of latter rains that happen here late in the season that would then prepare the spring over here. And the summers dry everything out, and then would lead to this kind of transition in fall. And here we go through the year. Reason why I bring that up is because you have these seasons where crops are picked. Again, I talked about how there's ingathering of crops, and you have barley being harvested here in kind of March, April. Again, the time, and that's the time when Pesach or Passover happens. You also notice that's right around when Easter happens. You have wheat that is harvested here in May, June, again, about 50 days after the barley. And you have fruit that's harvested all the way from July through to September. And this is going to be important to know or to have written down, especially as it relates to Israel's cycle system. The reason why I bring this up is that in order to help Israel after they enter into the land of Canaan, that these celebrations, these feasts will serve to override the syncretism, the possibility or the potential for Israel to join in the religious observances of the foreign nations around them. Essentially, these serve as safeguards from idolatry. And these redemptive events work in the agricultural year when people would be more tempted to honor Baal, again, who is himself a fertility god, a god of fertility. And so, again, built into Israel's practices is already, again, the safeguards against idolatry. So, genius move, again, that here, the celebration of Passover, here, the celebration of Pentecost, and here, the celebration of tabernacles, built as an alternative to the practices, the idolatrous practices of those that would be in the land of Canaan. But of course, as we come to find out, Israel has some issues. And so, as we'll get to talking about on Thursday, this leads over as we talk about justice in Deuteronomy. That you have the laws in chapters 12 through 26 interwoven with exhortations for the people to practice justice and to refuse idolatrous practices. The two are woven together, which is why I brought up the feasts in the first place. That the connection between Israel's worship and ethics are integrally and intentionally linked together. Their ethics and their worship are linked together. What they do from the day to day and what they do in their religious life are connected. They're integrally interwoven. That justice in Israel and in the reflecting the loyalty is meant to reflect Yahweh's just, compassionate, and merciful character towards their neighbors. But the problem is, wherever there's idolatry, there's going to be injustice. And again, what I want to emphasize through all of this is that it was through obedience that Israel is going to be a light to the nations, both in their worship and in their ethics. This way of living differently, fed by this worship of a different God and being formed by this different God, they're empowered to live differently. And these two things that are brought together in Torah is God's original intention for reaching the nations, of seeing this light that they might be brought into Yahweh's family, into his household. But as you go into Kings and Prophets, you'll soon hear and read how this falls apart very, very, very quickly, especially when they enter into the land. All right, any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? All right, well, if there are no